Very excited to welcome our latest guests. One is an author and host of the Glenn Show, and he is joined by his wife and supporter, aspiring DJ, retired cybersecurity consultant, Lawan. So let's welcome Glenn and Lawan Loury. Guys, great to meet you. Thanks so much for being here.
Welcome.
Keaton, Russell, good to be with you guys.
Happy All right. Well, I want to plug your book right at the top here. It's called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And we were put in touch with you guys via the Old Gray Lady, via the New York Times. Our name just happened to come up in a piece that was written in the New York Times about you, Glenn. He knows it's important to admit mistakes. He's made many. So this was listed as an opinion piece. I guess it was an interview / review of your new memoir, but we couldn't help but notice here he still got to check himself. Maybe he's wrong about your various political persuasions. This was in reference to his wife of 7 years, Lawan, is strongly committed to her progressive beliefs. Their marriage, he says, has had far-reaching implications for my own intellectual life. Together, they listen to the left-wing podcast she favors, The Jimmy Dore Show, Max Blumenthal, DueDissidence. Not only is he exposed to different ideas, but out of his respect for his wife, he has to self-interrogate a bit. So we're like, hey, you know what? If you guys are fans, maybe we'll reach out and see if you'd like to come on. And so we emailed Glenn, and I got, in response from Glenn, one of my favorite emails that we've ever gotten was from Mr. Glenn Loury. He says, my wife, thanks for reaching out. My wife is a big fan of the show, and I absorb it passively from across the kitchen table. Some of the highest praise we've ever received. So that was how we met you guys.
That was a notch above the guy who called us a couple of morons.
Yeah, right. Exactly. My wife's a fan, and I sometimes listen secondhand. So yeah, it's great to meet you guys. I just had a baby, so I'm not going to pretend that I am hyper prepared for this as much as I should be. I'll confess that at the outset. But I did listen to excerpts of your book on audio because I have the unlimited Kindle thing. And Russ has compiled a list of great questions. So I'll kick it off to Russell Dobler here.
All right. So to start off, you have a pretty fascinating background. I don't think a lot of people really know all this about you. You grew up on the south side of Chicago. You describe your section as working class, but you were close to the Robert Taylor homes, which were desperately poor. So you were in very close proximity to that. Your family had a range of backgrounds. Your father wound up working for the IRS. You had an uncle who was a successful lawyer until his own demons, you describe, kind of destroyed that. You had an aunt who owned an apartment building but dealt some weed on the side. This is not the usual background for an MIT trained economist. So you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I mean, it was not an unusual story for somebody coming off of the south side of Chicago, born in the late 1940s. But it was working class, middle class, some shopkeepers and stuff. I was lucky to grow up in a tree-lined street, backyard with fruit trees and, people trying to maintain a certain amount of respectability and whatnot. But as I say in the book, I mean, it was easy to cross over to the other side of the line, and there was a lot of other different kinds of stuff going on in that same general social milieu. And I was privy to that, or to a certain degree, a party to that. And that echoes throughout the course of the story I tell about my life in the book.
Now you described, this was very interesting, and this is something that keeps coming up. So eventually you wind up at Northwestern University. You'd been a very good student at school. But even so, by that time, you have a wife, you have one child, and shortly after you had a second with your first wife, Charlene.
Yes.
but you describe your fellow Black students as kind of fall radicals, as being from more elevated backgrounds than yours, and describing the struggle. And you say at one point, talk to my aunt, talk to my father about struggle. You don't really know about struggle. And that seems to keep coming up in the way you relate to Black radicals, which I would suggest, and I think you have the self-awareness, you pretty much say it at different points. This naturally led into your antagonism towards certain civil rights leaders and institutions later on, or am I mischaracterizing it?
Well, it didn't help. I mean, you have to understand, I was a father at the age of 18, and again at 19, and again at 21. And I had to drop out of college. I mean, I was already flunking out because I was not going to class, and I was, playing pool and, drinking vodka at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and chasing girls and stuff like that. And just, a kid finally set free from the constraints of close supervision of parents and elders, and, doing my own thing. And, I didn't do well in school. So I dropped out. I went to a community college. I got discovered by one of my professors there. He was a Northwestern alum. They had a program to bring kids from the South Side to Northwestern. I got interviewed. They offered me a scholarship. I ended up in Northwestern. Now I'm working a full-time job, 8 hours a night at a factory as a clerk, and getting on the public transit and making my way up to Evanston, Illinois, leafy green suburb, upper middle class. And the Black kids who were on campus there, by and large, they came from comfortable families and middle class backgrounds and whatnot. I'm not, they weren't rich. They weren't as rich as the white kids were, but they were, they were doing okay as far as I was. And I had a huge chip on my shoulder about these Negroes. They didn't know anything about what the ghetto was really like, and yet they wanted to be the blackest, the most radical, the most, black power. And I'm saying black, I know black. I know the ghetto. I know the, honky tonk taverns. I know the back alleys. I know how you cop drugs in the projects. I know, who the gangsters are. I can tell by the way they walk and the way, I've been in pool halls. I can get by, don't tell me anything about black. And that was kind of my attitude. And it was, maybe 3 parts them being snooty bourgeois Negroes, and it was 1 part me having a huge chip on my shoulder because I had to work 8 hours a day before I came to class.
So if I could just interject for a minute here, because I would like to ask Lawan. So, we're talking about Glenn's background. The New York Times piece, categorized you as a progressive. Is that an accurate description of your politics, and how has your background shaped what your politics are? I would assume you are a progressive, but I can't assume that what the New York Times says is accurate.
It's accurate.
Oh, there you go. It is accurate. Oh, they got it right.
It's accurate.
All right, so they're 1 for 2.
This isn't a war, Keaton.
They're wrong on weapons of mass destruction, but they categorize your politics correctly. There you go. That makes up for it.
Yes. I am progressive. I grew up basically poor. My mother raised 4 children by herself, and we were on welfare, and we were kicked off because my mother earned too much money, but it still wasn't enough money to feed 4 children and support them. She had 3 girls. Can you imagine raising 3 girls by yourself and all their needs? We were all within 1, 2, 3 years of each other, and it was tough. It was just tough. There'd be times my mother could only give us 25 cents to go to school with, and all we could buy was a honey bun to eat for the whole day. So, yeah, I know what it's like, and I just can't forget what it's like. I can't forget what it's like for other people who are still struggling. It bothers me. That's why I so much identify with those who are struggling. I'm not struggling anymore. However, it's something that's still visceral for me.
All right. That it's whenever you do these interviews, it's always the old line about boxing. Everyone's got a plan until they get hit. So I'm gonna go off book here for a second since you brought that up. So I was talking to Glenn about this before we went on, and I don't know if you've heard me say it. I don't know how much time you have to watch the show. I grew up with a single mother in a 1-bedroom apartment on welfare. And I've often said, because of that, I am sympathetic to a lot of views that are associated often with Black conservatives regarding welfare and the damage that it can do to a household. I don't know if you feel that was your experience. I definitely felt when I came to manhood that it had left me with a lot of disadvantages regarding understanding how to take care of myself, just the basics of doing taxes, man. I never saw anybody do that. I didn't know anything about it. It just wasn't even in my landscape. And Glenn, I'm not even sure what your views are on those kinds of programs, but I'm kind of in the middle. I think very often when you come up from under, a lot of people who come up from under can wind up being, and you mentioned Nietzsche in your book, can wind up being very Nietzschean. It's the force of your will, and you did it, and that's it. And a lot of people who come up from the streets who succeed wind up thinking like that. I would say I probably landed somewhere in the middle. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm one of those people who worries a lot about the dependency problem, and that helping someone is actually a hard thing to do, not an easy thing to do. The easiest thing to do is to give them money. The harder thing to do is to be prudential and wise about when to enable and when to let them have to deal with the consequences of their own irresponsible actions. And this is a bone of contention or a point of difference between my wife and myself. Yeah, I do take pride in the self-made man character of my own story, although no one gets there alone, as Obama pointed out. You didn't build that. And I mean, and it's true, without all kinds of different influences, including governmental program, the affirmative action from Northwestern University, a family background that I was fortunate to have, because even though there were some negative things, there was a lot of positive stuff going on. Mm-hmm. My aunt took my mother and my sister and I in when my mom was a young and not especially responsible single mother, and my aunt was a very well established, striving middle class businesswoman and with a good home. I grew up in a neighborhood much better than I might have otherwise grown up in,
right.
Much better in certain respects than the one that my wife grew up in, the third ward of inner city Houston, where George Floyd originated. Her brother, my wife's brother, and George Floyd were in effect classmates. They knew each other, coming along roughly the same age, the same neighborhood. So yeah, the conversation between LaJuan and I often turns on me saying, these people need to get their stuff together. They need to stop running down the street, firing pistols out of the window at their gang rivals and killing the baby sitting on their grandmother's knee. They need to get a job. They need to clean up their acts. They need to whatever. And her saying, try walking a mile in their moccasins. It's not so easy. Don't be so judgmental. Everybody's got a story. You think they want to be poor? This kind of thing. I don't mean to speak for her, but this is what I think is one of the points of creative friction between the two of us.
LaJuan, do you have a response to that? Yeah. I feel like I'm a marriage counselor here. I feel like we're doing therapy. No, how did that make you feel, LaJuan, when he said that?
As long as he doesn't call me Jane LaJuan, you ignorant slut, then we're good. Yes, we do have points of contention regarding that, because I grew up not only in Third Ward, but we lived in the suburbs. But the suburbs, there was a housing project called the Aristocrat Apartments, and the wealthy Black kids in the neighborhood, the middle class Black kids, called us the Aristorats, because we were the poor kids, and we had to ride the same bus as the kids from Brentwood. So, and there was lots of stuff going on in that project, but those families were struggling, and I just think that, yes, my husband is too judgmental. Yes, there are people who commit crimes. I believe they commit crimes out of desperation. I'm a big Thomas Paine fan, and Thomas Paine's position was out of poverty results crime and all kinds of other things. So and I'm I'm a living testimony to it. I didn't commit any crimes, but I saw a lot of it. Our house was burglarized. Our apartment was burglarized many times, and it's something we had to deal with.
Well, but speaking to the culture argument, and Glenn, I think this was your first major paper, your thesis. You got into social capital, and this applies, I think, to race as well as to class. You argued that part of your opportunities are not simply defined by the money available, it's also defined by the skills available in your community and in your family, that you're going to tend to rise to the level of available skills that the people around you have. And that's a problem that can't really be solved with money. Is that, would you, I mean, I assume you've both spoken about that. Would you agree with Glenn's views on that?
So not everyone handles money in the same manner. Money, a little extra money for us would have been welcomed. It would have made sure that we had a consistent meal every day. We would have been able to do certain other things, like my mother been able to put gas in the tank, fill up the tank every time. I think that at a point, yes, you have to be able to say, okay, I don't need this anymore. But when do you get to that point where you don't need assistance anymore? When food prices continue to increase, just the cost of living, rent keeps going up. When do you have to stop and say, okay, I don't need this help anymore?
Well, I
Glenn?
think, I mean, I think,
Go ahead, Keith.
you know, I think money matters to a large extent in a macro sense. You know, Bernie Sanders got a lot of shit for repeating ad nauseum, 90% of all new wealth goes to the top 1%. Well, if that is true, and it seems like that is true, that does mean less money going around for everybody else, which means whatever skills you have, it's going to be harder to get your hands on that money if that money is being funneled to the already richest 1% of people. And so that affects the opportunity. And I think that is a major hindrance when it comes to creating a system where you can have economic empowerment that transcends this dependency question, right? We interviewed about a month and a half ago Omali Yeshitela from the African People's Socialist Party. We're going to interview someone from their legal team soon because he might be going to jail soon on bogus Russiagate charges. That's a different story. But he criticizes the welfare state from the left. And what his organization has done is they have built basically self-sustaining economic systems within their communities. And they have sought economic self-determination through that model. And so I think a bigger question than simply, well, I think more than making it a question about dependency, I think it can also be a question about how do you build an economic system that transcends dependency, that empowers everybody? Because the what we have now is clearly empowering those who are already very wealthy and making it very, very difficult for anybody who was born to modest means to get a foothold, to buy a house. I mean, we all know the numbers.
Yes.
Well, Glenn, before you weigh in on that, I also want to mention you wrote a later paper basically arguing for a redistributive policy where wealthy families would have their wealth funneled to poorer families. So what are your views today on this?
Well, it's not a simple either or thing. I mean, I think I did in the same thesis in which I wrote
to the communists.
The same dissertation, MIT, 1976, a long time ago. My PhD, And I introduced the term social capital as a reference to the fact that money is not everything. Money is money. It's not nothing, but it doesn't substitute for parents who are disciplined and raise the kids and are responsible in their, doesn't substitute for peer influences that are affirmative of the kind of things that you need to do in order to get ahead in life, things of this kind. The role models and examples, if I grow up in a neighborhood where there are very few fathers, where nobody's getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning and going to work, that's going to have an impact on me beyond whether or not an additional dollar comes in from the welfare system. So money is not everything. Values, norms, the example of disciplined living on behalf of responsible exercise of your prerogatives, this is also very important. And I wanted to say that one of the things that slavery and Jim Crow did for many urban Black communities is create a circumstance in which the beneficial consequences of that kind of social network connectivity were missing, and money wouldn't alone substitute for those things. So that's a point that I would still make. I don't know how my wife would react to it, but the other thing I'd say is money is not nothing. And in the 1970s, when I was writing that dissertation at MIT, which is a relatively, Democrat, center left kind of ethos, it wasn't hard left, it wasn't radical, it wasn't Marxist, but it was Keynesian and friendly to the welfare state, and wanted to find work for people, and job training and things of this kind. The fact that wealthy families can do so much with their money for their children, and poor families do not have available to them those resources, that matters, because the kids of poor families on average are just as potentially productive as the kids of rich families. I want to say there's nothing intrinsically better on average about a kid in a rich family than a poor family, but the resources available to develop that potential talent are scarce for poor families. And so I tried to make a technical theoretical argument that redistribution from rich to poor could both reduce inequality, but also enhance efficiency. That was kind of my novel observation. You could get both better efficiency and more equity if you took advantage of the fact that poor families could use some resources to invest in the development of their children. This kind of idea.
Well, absolutely, and this is the Marxist in me, because this is the part of me that thinks that those kinds of economic factors influence the culture in such a major way. Back when I was an Uber driver, I'll keep this as quick as I can. I used to drive this woman, because when you drive in the same area and you're in a small town, you get the same riders, a couple times a week if you drive every day and you keep the same shift. So this woman was a manager of the Holiday Inn, and at like 2 o'clock she would go home, and she lived in a very modest apartment, kind of a rundown complex. And she was talking to me about how as soon as she gets home, she takes the baby and her husband goes to work, and she and her husband never see each other ever. They both work 7 days a week, different shifts. The child is never with both parents at the same time, because the money they make is not sufficient to make childcare worth it, because then they may as well lose one of their jobs, because one of their jobs goes right to childcare. So I agree, Glenn, with everything you're saying about personal responsibility and commitment and all of that. I think those are wonderful values that I try to live up to as best I can and try to instill in my guys. But when you go on Craigslist and you look in general labor employment listings and the top wage is $16 an hour, that is the ceiling at which those values get you when you live month to month, right? And that's not conducive to instilling the kind of values in people that I think we can all agree are positive.
Yeah, I just want to say for the record, I agree with that. You mentioned someone, I don't know the person, so I won't be able to repeat the name, but was a radical critique from the left of the welfare system. And I was thinking, yeah, I see that argument, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, you got a structure that's messed up and that doesn't give the little guy a chance. And then you have this little superficial little thing where, I'm drowning. Okay, I'll throw you a lifeline. Not enough to get you out of the water, but enough so that you don't go completely under, when the deeper problem might be better wages for working people and so on like that. unions, higher minimum wage, stuff that a neoliberal like me chafes at a little bit, but I hear it constantly from this woman sitting here.
Well, his name is
Well,
Omali Yeshitela, and you have a popular YouTube show. You should absolutely try to interview him. That would be a fascinating episode.
that would be a really interesting. Well, I
And he
can
might
tell
not
you
be a
about
free
him.
man much longer, so you should probably get on. I'll give you his contact.
Get
He's
get
going on
on
trial
get
in a
on
month.
him while
Yeah.
he's still out. Well,
Yeah.
well, Glenn, I mean, part of why I find a lot of these views understandable and relatable, and I even agree up to a certain point. And you went ahead and ascended to the heights. We'll get into that more. You almost wound up in the Reagan administration, and yet you had a whole second life that was very much impacted by the culture. I think you would say the culture and community you came from. If you had not come from that kind of an environment, it probably never would have occurred to you to have this whole second life of pool halls and prostitutes and cocaine. Now, to a much lesser extreme, I got off the streets, and you know what? I kept getting arrested for years. For years, I kept taking arrests. Nothing major, but the way I conducted myself, even after I had an education, I had my own businesses, I had theaters in the East Village, I would get arrested in the middle of running my theaters. I would go to jail for some nonsense. That didn't happen to the people I knew from the suburbs who did not come from that background. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that it's not just money. It's not just money. If you have a whole cultural milieu like that, it has an impact on you. Money is something, as you said, as we all agree. It's not everything. But how do you solve that? That is the problem. How do you really solve that in a way that is not a police state, right? I mean, what do? You round everybody up and put them in re-education camps? Like, what do you do to fix that?
I'm about to make a confession. My book is called Late Admissions: Confessions of a Black Conservative. I'm about to make a confession. So I was coming out of the Black community in Southside Chicago, not poor, but not rich either, and close to a lot of dicey stuff, and knowing my way around the inner city, the projects, the ghetto. But I was also on a fast track to a wholly different life altogether. I just told you that I was a student at Northwestern with children and working a full-time job. And when I left that, I went east. I went east to MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University, the ultra elite European intellectual influence, very prominent cultural thing. What wine do I drink at dinner? What fork when there are 3 forks at the table, and this kind of thing. And if I had a chip on my shoulder with respect to those upper middle class Black kids at Northwestern, I definitely had senses of insecurity and did I really belong and whatnot in this new milieu that I was entering into. And I didn't want to lose touch with my roots. I wanted to remain somehow authentic. I didn't want to be one of those, I call them the Negro cognoscenti, these elite upper middle class Black people. I wanted to be real. I wanted to be down with the brothers in the hood, this kind of. And I found an outlet that allowed me to maintain a certain sense of my own perception of authenticity by hanging out in the honky-tonk bars in inner city Boston, by changing my uniform from, jeans and a plaid shirt with a pocket protector going to classes at MIT to, bell-bottom pants. I mean, it was the 1970s, man. And, a flowery shirt.
That was the real crime.
And I could go into these clubs and I could get by. I could manage. I could carry, I find my way through that. And I took a certain pride in that. I took pride in knowing who the dope dealer was. Pride in being able to go up to a guy who sells trinkets off of a tabletop near a public transit station for a living, and who plays 5-minute chess against anybody who comes along as a pastime, and making really good friends with that guy and hanging out with him and his associates because they were authentic, real Black people. So for me, part of the complexity of why it is that I ended up in the double life posture was that I was trying to stay in touch with something that I thought was authentically Black. I am not defending that position. You can say that that's really perverse. That's how you identified Blackness, with the ugliest and seamiest underside of life in the inner city. But the truth of the matter is, I knew how to cop weed in the projects, and I took pride in that. And I knew the guy who was, fencing stolen goods, just like my uncle used to do out of the back of his barbershop when I was coming along. And I took pride in that. And I could change my uniform and walk down the streets in some of these neighborhoods, and no one would ever guess for a minute that I had just come across the river from MIT.
Yes. Isn't an element of that a combination of imposter syndrome and survivor's guilt?
Well, I mean, if we're going to pretend to be psychologists, yeah, I suppose that's the way that we would put it. I wouldn't have had the insight to quite put it that way. But yeah, there were elements of both of those things. Imposter syndrome. Do I really belong? Am I really good enough to be here? Survivor's guilt. Why me?
Right.
I'm not really any different than anybody else that you would have pulled off of the streets of Chicago in the late 1960s or early 1970s. And
Yeah,
here I am.
I struggled with that for a long time. I was worse than a lot of the kids I grew up with. I would steal cars. I was dealing drugs out of my house. Why do I get to just go to college and take off the uniform and go live like one of these rich kids? Why do I get to do that? That was very hard for me for a long time. Long time.
Please clap.